Hello, and welcome to the 8th episode of The Bible and You, a program focused on the study of God's holy word without any preconceived dogma or denominational doctrine. Last episode, I told you that this episode would start with the second covenant between God and man. That subject is probably the most important topic in the entire Bible, and I want to do my best on it, so I am going to postpone it briefly. Instead, in this episode, there are three subjects that need some clarification. Those subjects, in the order that I will deal with them, are time versus eternity, the Nephilim, one more time, and who is a Jew? Now, metaphysics, in the traditional sense, is an attempt to understand the fundamental nature of all reality, whether it's visible or invisible, and it often uses very subtle or contorted reasoning. For me, attempting to understand the concept of infinity in either space or time falls into that category. It is truly beyond the capabilities of my human mind. One reason I believe this is so is that in my current mortal state, I am not infinite in either space or time. My mortal life had a beginning and will have an end, and I'm certainly constrained by the limits of the three physical dimensions in which I live. When I become immortal, my understanding of immortality will undoubtedly improve, and when I become, as John described, those who are born again, I will no longer be limited by distance of any sort. Listen to John 3:8. The wind bloweth where it listeth, and thou hearest the sound thereof, but canst not tell whence it cometh, and whither it goeth. So is every one that is born of the Spirit. Until that time, I have only my human mind with which to understand eternity, and it is a real challenge, so bear with my simplistic explanation. Only God the Father has always existed. He had no beginning and will have no end, so the concept of time didn't exist because it simply wasn't needed. Time is a measurement, and if a thing has no beginning and no end, there is nothing to measure. The Almighty's first creation was the morning star who would come to earth as Jesus. The morning star was created before time, and he said of himself, quote, I am the Alpha and the Omega, the beginning and the end, the first and the last. That's Revelation 22:13. Clearly he was referring to the creation by God the Father when he said he was the beginning and the end. The beginning and the end of God the Father's creation. He also said he was the first and the last, that is, the first thing created by the Father and also the last thing the Father created directly. As you may recall from episode 2, the Father turned all creation over to the Son, who in turn created everything else from angels to the physical universe to the earth and all its inhabitants. But what are we to make of Revelation 1:8 when Jesus said, I am Alpha and Omega, the beginning and the ending, saith the Lord, which is and which was and which is to come, the Almighty? How can it be that Jesus is the Almighty, a title usually reserved for God the Father? Or how can it be in the 10th chapter of John when Jesus said to the Pharisees, I and my Father are one? How can it be that one being, the Father, created another being, the Son, and yet they are one? Well, here's the way my limited intellect can cope with it. The Father created the Son, and at some point the Father gave the Son himself. His knowledge, his memories, his complete essence, all of that was transferred from God the Father to God the Son. At that point, they became one in spirit forever, never to be separated and always to be in accord. And if the Son truly has all the knowledge and the memories and the Spirit of the Father, he is absolutely correct to call himself the Almighty and to claim to be one with the Father. Of course, the Pharisees never understood this, and they threatened to stone him, but he escaped out of their hands. That's John 10:39. We know, of course, that Jesus was given eternal life by God the Father, and our limited understanding causes us to conclude that means that Jesus will live forever in the future, which is, of course, true. but I believe that the knowledge and the memories and the essence imparted by the Father to the Son also means that forever goes backward as well as forward. In other words, when the Father gave all this to the Son took on the properties of the Father, including the property of having existed forever. To put it in human terms, think of it this way. I've made several trips to the Far East. If I could transfer all my knowledge and memories of those trips to another person, then that person would have essentially been there and done all the things that I did. I know that's a weak example, but maybe it helps to convey the concept that I'm trying to describe. And at the risk of overstepping my boundaries, I think that the relationship that all converted Christians will have to God in the fifth creation, that is, in our future, is similar to the relationship that exists between God the Father and Jesus the Son. We truly will be one with God. Time and space will be meaningless to us because neither will limit us in the slightest. Now on to the second subject. I'd like to add some clarification as to why I believe that none of the Nephilim giants, that is the offspring of Nephilim angels and humans, survived the great flood of Noah's day. In verse 13 of Genesis 6, God said, and I quote, "The end of all flesh is come before me, for the earth is filled with violence through them, and behold, I will destroy them with the earth." The end of all flesh, and the them that God referred to, were the Nephilim giants, who at that point in time had physically corrupted the bloodlines of almost all human beings. It was imperative that they be destroyed to the last in order to fulfill His second covenant with man, which we will deal with in future episodes. And I believe that God accomplished His purpose, and that the mortal bodies of the Nephilim giants were destroyed, and that none, not even one, survived. However, there is a reference to Nephilim giants in the Bible after the flood. And as I told you in episode 1, there are no scriptures that I have excised from my Bible or from my study. Let me read the verse to you from Numbers 13:33 in the American Standard Version. And I quote, "And there we saw the Nephilim, the sons of Anak, who come of the Nephilim. And we were in our own sight as grasshoppers, and so we were in their sight." The New International Version and the Revised Standard Versions both use very similar words to the ASV. The Moffat translation says, and I quote, "We saw the Nephilim there. The giant clans belong to the Nephilim. They made us feel like grasshoppers, and grasshoppers we were to them." So there it is. Absolute proof that Nephilim giants survived the great flood and inhabited the land of Canaan, right? No, it's not proof of that at all. What it is proof of is that someone said to Moses that they saw Nephilim giants, and I firmly believe that they did say that, but I also believe that they lied to Moses, or if you prefer, they greatly exaggerated what they saw. To understand why they stretched the truth to this extent, we must know the whole story. This particular statement was made very near the end of 40 years of wandering by the Israelites after the Exodus from Egypt. They had come close to the land that God had promised them, and Moses sent a scout team of 12 men into the land to look it over and report back about it. And I quote, "And Moses sent them to spy out the land of Canaan, and said unto them, Get you up this way southward, and go up into the mountain, and see the land, what it is, and the people that dwelleth therein, whether they be strong or weak, few or many, and what the land is that they dwell in, whether it be good or bad, and what cities be that they dwell in, whether in tents or in strongholds, and what the land is, whether it be fat or lean, whether there be wood therein or not. And be ye of good courage, and bring of the fruit of the land." That's from Numbers 13, verses 17 through 20 in the King James Version. No doubt Moses wanted them to bring back a favorable report. After all the time they had spent wandering in the wilderness, he, like all the rest, must have wanted a permanent home. Unfortunately, many among them longed for Egypt, and apparently still agreed with those who almost 40 years earlier had said, and I quote, "Would to God we had died by the hand of the Lord in the land of Egypt, when we sat by the flesh pots, and when we did eat bread to the full. For ye," speaking of Moses, "have brought us forth into this wilderness to kill the whole assembly with hunger." That's Exodus 16:3. When they returned, that is, the spies returned 40 days later, the number of them who gave a favorable report compared to those who gave an unfavorable report was very small. Only 2, Joshua and Caleb, gave a positive report. The other 10 spies were united in their opposition to crossing over the Jordan River. And I quote, "And they told him," Moses, "and said, We came unto the land whither thou sentest us, and surely it floweth with milk and honey, and this is the fruit of it. Nevertheless, the people be strong that dwell in the land, and the cities are walled and very great. And moreover, we saw the children of Anak there. The Amalekites dwell in the land of the south, and the Hittites and the Jebusites and the Amorites dwell in the mountains, and the Canaanites dwell by the sea and by the coast of Jordan." That's Numbers 13:27 through 29. Caleb, one of the 2 scouts who favored continuing to Canaan, persisted with his opinion that the Israelites could prevail. But the others continued their objection. And I quote again, "But the men that went up with him said, We be not able to go up against the people, for they are stronger than we." That's verse 31. And as if to press their point home, they added, "The land through which we have gone to search it is a land that eateth up the inhabitants thereof, and all the people that we saw in it are men of a great stature." That's verse 32. Now I can only imagine that there were raised eyebrows at this claim that all of the inhabitants of Canaan were of great stature. But just in case that wasn't alarming enough, the naysayers played their trump card, and I quote, "And there we saw the giants, the sons of Anak, which come of the giants, and we were in our own sight as grasshoppers, and so we were in their sight." That's verse 33 from the King James Version. Notice how the claims grow from one statement to the next. In verse 31, the report is that they are stronger than we. But in verse 32, they add, "They're all of great stature." And finally, in verse 33, they're the stuff of legends, the Nephilim giants themselves. Doubtless the Israelites had heard the stories of the Nephilim giants in antediluvian times and the terrible violence they had caused upon the earth. So this cowardly lie by the 10 deceitful scouts had its intended effect and sent the whole people of Israel into a panic, as we read in Numbers 14, verses 1 through 4 in the King James Version. "And all the congregation lifted up their voice and cried, and the people wept that night. And all the children of Israel murmured against Moses and against Aaron. And the whole congregation said unto them, Would God that we had died in the land of Egypt, or would God that we had died in this wilderness? And wherefore hath the Lord brought us unto this land to fall by the sword, that our wives and our children should be a prey? Were it not better for us to return to Egypt? And they said one to another, Let us make a captain, and let us return to Egypt." Well, I hope you'll read the rest of that story for yourself, but that's as far as I need to go with it to demonstrate my point, which is this. There were no Nephilim giants on the earth after the flood. Certainly there were big men. Goliath was said to be 10 feet tall, and there was another who had 6 fingers and 6 toes, and yet another who had a spear like a weaver's beam. Giants? Yes. Nephilim? Not a chance. God said he would wipe them from the face of the earth, and so he did. By the way, as I told you in an earlier episode, I love the King James Bible. To me, it is the most beautiful of all the translations, the one I turn to first, and the one I prefer when I am reading for pure pleasure. However, it's not a perfect translation, as is demonstrated by the fact that in Numbers 13:33, the verse we've just read, the word Nephilim is not even present in the King James Version, yet it is in the American Standard, the Revised Standard, the Moffat, and some others. To me, refusing to read any translation other than the King James would be like refusing to use a concordance, or to even consider the original languages in which the Scriptures were written. Which brings me to another thought, and that is whether the word Nephilim refers to the fallen angels or to the mixed-breed children of the fallen angels and humans. I realize there's some disagreement over this, and without naming names, there are some well-respected scholars who insist that Nephilim can only refer to the giant offspring and not to the angels themselves. They take this position, at least in part, to refute the idea that the fallen angels were actually alien invaders, which is a thesis of yet another well-known writer with whom many vehemently disagree. As you know, if you have listened to my previous episodes, I firmly believe that the angels who were led to rebellion by Satan are referred to in the Scriptures as Nephilim. I also believe that the offspring of these angels and humans are referred to as Nephilim as well. To avoid confusion on this program, I try to be specific and call them Nephilim angels or Nephilim giants, depending on whether I'm referring to the angels or their mixed offspring. And it seems to me that Numbers 13:33 backs up my position. Let me quote part of it to you again from the American Standard Version. And I quote, "And there we saw the Nephilim, the sons of Anak, who come of the Nephilim." End of quote. In that verse, which I still maintain was a lie from the cowardly spies, the first Nephilim is a reference to the giants, and the second Nephilim is a reference to the fallen angels. I believe it could be correctly paraphrased as, "And there we saw the Nephilim giants, the sons of Anak, who come of the Nephilim angels." All right, now to my final subject of this episode. I have recently been listening to some recordings of Bill Cooper, a somewhat legendary figure that is considered by many people to be a major contributor in the modern-day unmasking of the New World Order. I'm not quite sure what I think of Bill Cooper. Some of what he says makes sense, but some of it is beyond belief to me. However, on one of the recordings I listened to recently, he was taking calls from listeners, and one of the listeners seemed to want to blame much of the world's turmoil on the Jews. I hear people doing that today. Bill Cooper took exception to this, berated the man unmercifully, and launched into a tirade about how stupid the caller was to not know that the term Jew referred to a religion and not to a group of people. The caller tried to reason with Cooper, but Cooper would have it no way except his own. Finally, Cooper said that if Jew referred to a group of related people instead of a religion, then all Muslims would be called Jews, since the Muslims were descended from Abraham. Of course, that's completely wrong for two very important reasons. Abraham begat two sons, Ishmael and Isaac. They had two different mothers. Ishmael became the progenitor of the Arab peoples, many of whom hundreds of years later accepted Muhammad as their prophet and therefore became Islamic or Muslim by faith. Isaac begat Jacob, whose name was changed by God to Israel, and he, Jacob/Israel, begat 12 sons, one of whom was named Judah. Technically, only the descendants of Judah are Jews, and the rest are members of one of the other tribes of Israel. However, the term Jew can and is used to refer to members of the religion of Judaism, which can be practiced by anyone, whether they're descended from Judah or Israel or Abraham or none of the above. Now, the reason that this is important to me has nothing to do with the late Bill Cooper. What he thought about Jews is of no real consequence to me. What is important to me is that I am often accused, or maybe credited, with being a Jew. When someone learns that I keep God's seventh-day Sabbath, they often say, "Oh, you keep the Jewish Sabbath," in that partly amused, partly patronizing, partly accusatorial way. Some of you may have experienced this and know what I mean. I usually reply by saying, "I keep the same Sabbath that Jesus kept," and let it go in the knowledge that their biblical education is so scant that they really don't understand that the seventh-day Sabbath was given to man thousands of years before there was a Jew. I'd like to educate them, but most have no real interest in the Sabbath, or as they say, any of those Jewish commandments. They're thoroughly indoctrinated into Sunday keeping and are often proud to say that they belong to a New Testament church and don't read the Old Testament. You, on the other hand, must have a sincere interest in the Bible, or you wouldn't be listening to me now. So I hope you have a basic chronology of the patriarchs and the major events of the first 4,000 years of biblical history in your mind. It is essential to understanding God's overall plan for man and the extent that he goes to in order to fulfill his basic objective, which is to create God-children for himself. If I didn't have access to the books of the Bible that deal with events prior to the birth of Jesus on earth, I wouldn't have a chance of understanding what Jesus said or what the apostles wrote. Well, maybe I've said enough for today. Next time I will try to start the second covenant and continue with the explanation of why it is so important that Noah was perfect in his generations. Until then, please pray that the Creator God will guide me in this program and that nothing that I say will detract from His glory. All mistakes are mine, not His. Thanks for listening. And until the next time on The Bible and You, may God bless you and keep you in His will. And don't neglect to study your Bible, to pray, and to reach your own conclusions. Don't take my word for anything.